I'll bring in one. That's good. Um, I'll bring in one more thing. I spoke already about the in the other room about the control over the airspace, the control over the sea space, the electromagnetic space. A little bit more about the permit regime. Israel controls the population registry in Gaza. That is the case before the takeover by Hamas of the Gaza Strip. And what that means is that every baby who's born in Gaza receives a biometric identification card and is registered by the Israelis. Everyone that dies in Gaza is registered by Israel to have died. Israel has control over this population registry, which is a central part of how civilians access civil rights, how people manage to, even the very, very, very small percentage of people in Gaza who manage to exercise their freedom of movement, it's exercised because through this population registry, because they're applying for permits based on Israel's database of information. So that's just one of many examples that I gave before and that I've given now about why Gisha believes that that is a misconception, that Israel no longer controls Gaza and therefore doesn't have any obligations to the civilians. I'd say that's false.
Just to clarify, you're saying that because they control so much, they de facto continue to occupy.
Yes, I would say that all of this is obviously, occupation is a concept in international law. The criteria which are required to have obligations to a civilian population, Israel obviously does not own that it is an occupying power in Gaza. And actually, just now, about 10 days ago, 9 days ago, Gisha had a case in the Israeli Supreme Court. We filed a petition and had a hearing about aid to the north of the Gaza Strip. And one of the pieces of evidence that we brought was an expert opinion about the Israeli occupation of Gaza, both the entirety of Gaza and also particularly northern Gaza right now, because obviously, as by Israel's own lights, it controls militarily the north of Gaza. So we gave an expert opinion made by many international lawyers in Israel, Israelis, about why this constitutes an occupation. Israel doesn't own that it's an occupation, but even Israel has admitted that it has certain responsibilities to the civilians in Gaza because of its control. Those responsibilities aren't as fleshed out as they are by our understanding of Israel as an occupying power, but Israel itself recognizes that the level of control, and that's, by the way, the underlying logic underneath, for example, the calorific calculation. Israel itself recognizes that the level of control that it has is to the minutiae of the fabric of life, including how many calories someone in Gaza eats. So it's the writing's on the wall.
Thank you. This is another thought that exists certainly in Israel and certainly in the diaspora, and I think in some ways we all agree with it. The question is this: it is naive to suggest that living with a terrorist group on your border, and I added this part, which boasts of trying to annihilate you, can just be tolerated. Doesn't Israel have a right to defend itself?
Thanks, John. Israel absolutely has a right to defend itself, as does every sovereign nation. The question, I think, is about what does the right to defend itself mean, and what is it also used as a guise to cover? Israel has a right to defend itself, but does self-defense extend to, for example, the starvation of a population? I think most of us would be dubious, at the very least, about that as a concept. There's obviously broader questions which are outside of Gisha's mandate as a human rights organization about whether these forms of self-defense are actually effective at creating security. It's not something that I can comment on, I can imply. But Israel has the right to defend itself, but we always have to be asking, what form is this right? Kind of, how is it manifesting? And are the actions of the Israeli government and the military right now, do they all properly come under the notion of the right to self-defense? I think that it's really important that we always keep that in mind. And I think the secondary thing that I would say is that there's this misconception that having war crimes committed against you nullifies your obligations not to commit war crimes. And Hamas, as a terrorist organization, has clearly, as we can see documented, targeted civilians in ways that are unlawful under international law. That does not mean that Israel does not have absolute obligations under international law to protect civilian lives. It does not give you a carte blanche to break international law if you have a terrorist organization living beside you. And I think it's really important that we remember that. Israel is a state which enjoys all of the privileges of being a Western liberal nation, as self-regarded and also regarded by the West itself. And as such, it's important that Israel fulfill the obligations of all of the treaties that it signed on to and earn, those privileges.
And Israel does say that it must abide by international law and says it does. So there's a whole question of proportionality that is going to be probably decided after this war, not now. But thank you very much for that. Last month, the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System, that's a system that determines whether or not people are starving, issued a report warning that about half of Gaza's population faces, and I quote, catastrophic food insecurity, and that around 70% of an estimated 300,000 people still in Gaza City will probably experience famine within the next 2 months. At the same time, Israeli government spokespersons are claiming that the same amount of aid is entering Gaza as prior to October 7. Alternatively, I have heard that Israel blames Hamas and armed gangs for impeding the distribution of the assistance that is entering. Where does the truth lie between these competing assertions?
Thank you. I'll start with the end, which is, as you can see, I will always come back to Israel's obligations as part of Israeli civil society. I think it's incredibly important, as I mentioned already, that we hold our government to account. It may or may not be the case that aid is being redirected or hoarded. It's very unclear what the situation is with that, what the evidence is for what's going on with the aid in terms of people taking it and either profiteering from it or etc. Those kind of claims that you were talking about. Even if that is the case, even if it were the case on a much wider scale, Israel has an obligation to ensure that food makes its way into the mouths of the starving population in Gaza. Israel is a country with great minds who are not incapable of finding solutions where needed. And we've seen that this week when, due to pressure from the Biden administration and other actors, Israel has, after talking about how there's no limit on on aid, talked about that's been a talking point, central talking point of Israel's for the last 6 months. We've now seen Israel say it's going to increase the aid in the Gaza Strip through opening Ashdod port, opening Erez crossing, other kind of measures which Gisha have been pushing for many, many months. So despite saying that there was no limit, Israel has actually ceded to these demands by the international community and said that it will increase this aid. So that really begs the question of why didn't this happen before, and also demonstrates that where there's a will, there's a way. So I would say that ultimately Israel has that obligation no matter what's going on in Gaza. I'd also address what you asked about the famine. Famine is mostly a retroactive label. It's mostly unclear whether or not a situation has got to the point of famine during that reality. And it's mostly something which is retroactively understood. Having said that, regardless of the label of famine, we know that there's a huge amount of hunger and food insecurity in Gaza. The entirety of the Gaza Strip is in an acute food insecurity. We know that according to the UN, with information that they got from the Ministry of Health in Gaza, 28 children have died of starvation in hospital in the Gaza Strip. So that's only the children who made it to hospital. So we don't know how many children are dying of starvation in the Gaza Strip who aren't dying in hospital. You talked about the different narratives and different numbers that are coming out. of the Gaza Strip, either from the Gaza Ministry of Health or from the international aid organizations or from the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers. I think it's important for me to add that it's very likely that the death toll that we have, which is as of this week, 33,600, upwards of that, is very, very likely a massive underestimate. Because first of all, there's estimated to be 7,000 people under the rubble. Obviously, that's been the case for many, many months. That number has been used. So it's very unlikely that most of those people have survived. There's also not the ability right now for the Ministry of Health and for the internationals to be counting all of those fatalities. And a word also on the notion of the inflation of the numbers. As I mentioned before, Israel controls the population registry in the Gaza Strip, and that includes registering all of the people who've died. At some point in the future, I assume, we don't know because we don't know exactly what the policy and who's going to be in control of Gaza in the future, but at some point, it will be likely that, as the Ministry of Health has started to already this week when they brought out a document of thousands of names of people who've been killed, they will have to register all of the people who've been killed as dead on those population registries if Israel continues to control the population registry. It's not in the interests of any of those people to be registered as dead, because if you're alive but you're not registered as alive, then you won't be able to access any of those civil rights that I talked about, like permits and things like that. So it would actually be very problematic for those numbers to be inflated. Additional to the fact that the Biden administration, as well as the Israeli military, have talked about their reliance on those numbers, and that those numbers usually haven't been inflations in the past in previous military campaigns. So I think it's really important that we do listen to the international aid organizations on the ground when they talk about the scale of this humanitarian catastrophe. And I meet with humanitarians at least once a week. Many of the people working there have never seen such a situation in their lives as aid workers. We've also seen 200 aid workers being killed. Obviously, the World Central Kitchen 7 being a very highly publicized case of this. But I think that it's essential that we don't minimize the humanitarian catastrophe, because that catastrophe has to be addressed for there to even be, the title of this conference, Day After, for there to even be a day after, the humanitarian catastrophe must be the first thing that's addressed.
Thanks very much. We should acknowledge that Israel has said repeatedly that of that number, which is now 33,600, there could be up to 10 to 12,000 of those who were militants, terrorists who were fighting for Hamas. So but nonetheless, we're talking about over 20,000 innocent Palestinians who had nothing to do with the war. I think the other thing we have to acknowledge here is that, as was said from the podium before, we have an ability to criticize Israel, in part because we love Israel, because we want Israel to exist, because we want it to exist in peace and security. We have no control over Hamas. We condemn what they do. We condemn the hostage taking. We condemn October 7th. And when people say, why aren't you criticizing Hamas? Of course we criticize Hamas, violently criticize them, but we have no control, and the international community has no control. And so simply to turn it around and put criticism on Hamas doesn't really get us very far in terms of humanitarian assistance, Israel's obligations, etc. Next question. Gisha has called for a ceasefire agreement, and in particular is calling for the restoration of the supply of electricity and water from Israel to Gaza. Rebecca, can you explain for us how and why Israel controls the electricity and the water in Gaza? What does that relationship look like? And how has it changed post-October 7? Maybe also you mentioned the importance of fuel from the podium, but you didn't actually get into it. So you could perhaps talk about that.
Yeah, thank you. I will. And they're all very interconnected, so I'll definitely speak about them. I'll start with electricity. So about 1/3 of the, okay, starting with electricity and the situation in Gaza before October 7th. In Gaza before October 7th, there was electricity for about half the day. So it was a cycle of 8 hours on, 8 hours off. In the height of summer and winter, there was slightly less because the supply could not meet the demand because people need to run AC or heating in their houses, that kind of thing. We all use more energy during the more extreme weather. But generally speaking, that was around the situation. About 1/3 of that electricity is generated by Gaza's power plant, which runs on diesel. This diesel fuel is purchased in recent years by Qatar and goes in via the Kerem Shalom crossing, which is the the perimeter crossing between Gaza and Israel. So as such, Israel has a degree of control over what goes in. Since October 7th, we've seen, as I mentioned, until mid-November, no fuel was allowed into Gaza whatsoever, including via Rafah or via Kerem Shalom. Since then, Israel continues to cap fuel. There are various kind of anomalous entries, but generally speaking, Israel is capping fuel at around 170,000 liters per day. None of this fuel is allowed to go to the power plant anyway. So Gaza's power plant is quite fuel inefficient. And if there's an undersupply of fuel, then it makes more sense for it to go to private generators. But anyway, Israel has earmarked the fuel that it's not allowed to go into the power plant. So that's 1/3. The other 2/3 of the electricity in Gaza is purchased by the Palestinian Authority from Israel, from an Israeli company, and goes into Gaza directly through power lines, which come from Israel into Gaza. On October 7th, as part of Gallant's siege plan, that electricity was cut off. So since October 11th, there's been no electricity in Gaza's power grid. So the small amount of electricity which is happening, which is, how humanitarians are able to do what they do, how people are able to charge phones, that kind of thing, is all from this small amount of fuel that's going into private generators. So that's the relationship between fuel and electricity. Water is also related to fuel and electricity. Gaza was in a water crisis before October 7th. The water consumption in Gaza did not meet the World Health Organization's minimum standard. The UN actually deemed Gaza unlivable before October 7th. And I really cannot stress enough that the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening now in Gaza is not a natural extension of the borderline crisis that was beforehand. It's in a completely different league. So when I talk about the humanitarian situation in Gaza beforehand, I want to make absolutely clear that while it was already on the border of a big crisis, what we're seeing now is exponentially worse than what we had before. So I just want to make that absolutely clear. But as I mentioned, Gaza was already in a water crisis before October 7th. The main source of water in Gaza is from Gaza's aquifer. This water needs to be desalinated. There's contamination from seawater, so the wells in Gaza can produce salty water. So the water needs to be desalinated, which requires energy to desalination facilities. This energy, obviously, related to the fuel and electricity that I was talking about before. The other source, the minority source of water in Gaza is water purchased by the PA from Mekorot, Israeli water company, and which comes in through 3 pipelines from Israel into Gaza. As part of Gallant's siege policy, these pipelines were also switched off. The international community massively campaigned for them to be brought back. We talked before about notions of proportionality and the kind of ambiguity about whether Israel's committing war crimes. And I think that we can say with certainty that using starvation as a weapon of war is, of course, a war crime. And so the international community was very adamant that Israel switch the water back on. Since the start of the war, only one of those pipelines has been on more consistently. It's running at 83% capacity. Israel has last week said that it wants to turn the water on to the north, the pipeline which goes to the north, which has been off for the entirety. Sometimes two pipelines have been running, sometimes one. The water to the north has been off the entire time. Israel has now said that it wants to open it back up. And COGAT, which is the coordinator of government activities in the territories, it's the wing of the Israeli military, which is assigned with dealing with civilian life in the occupied territory. COGAT have said that the northern pipeline has been repaired. It remains to be seen if that's true, and if that's the case, whether it's now going to be turned on. We're all holding our breath for water to get to the north. And as it stands, electricity and fuel for electricity is also needed to actually pump the water into homes. So right now, even the water which is present is not able to be distributed into homes because, again, that needs electricity. So those are all the kind of hows of electricity and water and fuel that you asked about.
Maytal, how are we doing on time? Good. Excellent. Okay. So let's talk about the international community. You're in Israel. In your opinion, is the international community doing enough to help bring peace to the region and to help to resolve some of these issues?
Thanks. I'll talk a little bit first about the role of the international community in the immediate crisis, and then hopefully time permitting, we'll talk a bit about the more longer term. So in this immediate crisis, it's abundantly clear that one of the only tools that we have left to basically hold Israel to account for the civilians in Gaza is international pressure. And as we've seen, one phone call from Biden can make all the difference. And it's not just Biden. The entire international community has obligations to the civilians as third-party states. And it's essential that we are always applying pressure on Israel to be transparent and accountable about all of its policies towards civilians in Gaza. For our part, we try to add the domestic pressure. So Gisha has 2 freedom of information requests right now, which we're waiting to hear back from the Israeli government. And one of them is about what is the calculation that's happening about the minimum aid needed, because COGAT talk a lot about that there's enough aid, that there's no starvation, but we have no transparency around how they're making these calculations. Are there humanitarian experts who are actually coming in and measuring malnutrition? Because as far as we can see from the humanitarian experts who are on the ground, they are all saying the same thing, which is that there's not enough food, there's not enough water. So we want to understand, and we try to apply the domestic pressure to have accountability and transparency from our government. That pressure also has to come from the outside. And it's, as Nadav talked about, and Nadav is an old colleague of mine, I have so much respect for him. And as he talked about, the thing that Israel's best friends can do right now is to hold Israel to account and to say, enough is enough. You need to do more for these civilians, to actually rein in this vengeful government that we've seen and the comments that they've made. If you consider yourself a friend to Israel, then I think it's absolutely essential that you hold Israel to account right now. In terms of the other things regarding the international community, I think it's very important that I do address UNRWA as well. The international community, it's pretty much unthinkable that the humanitarian catastrophe can be addressed without UNRWA. UNRWA's logistical pipelines and corridors are those which the entire rest of the international community, in terms of the aid workers, are relying on right now in order to distribute aid in Gaza. Therefore, it's really essential that funding to UNRWA continue. Obviously, we saw that UNRWA nearly was on the verge of a massive crisis in terms of the defunding. And it's incredibly important that we are funding the humanitarian efforts at the moment. Thinking a little bit more long term, it's really important, in my opinion, that if you support a 2-state solution, to push back on Israeli policy, which aims to undermine the viability of a Palestinian state. And specifically, when I talk about that now, I'm talking about the separation policy that I mentioned before. The separation policy is an official policy which has been used even in court with Gisha. Israeli officials have referenced the separation policy. And the goal of the separation policy is to fragment the Palestinian territory and undermine the viability of a Palestinian state. Israel enacts a separation policy through various means, obviously restrictions on travel that I spoke about before. There are other means, and some of these are also intersect with all of our, I believe and assume, our shared interests in a gender-sensitive lens to what's going on in Israel and Palestine. Specifically, when people, let's say a woman in the West Bank wants to marry a man who's in Gaza, they can't make their family life, they can't access their right to family life by him relocating to the West Bank, because it's not possible for that to happen according to Israeli policy. So she would have to move into Gaza and to set up her family life there. In this situation, Israel coerces people to signing what's called a declaration of settlement, where they formally give up their right to live in the West Bank and say that they'll never live in the West Bank again, and now they're going to live in Gaza. This is a form of basically demographic massaging to try to bring people, Palestinians, out of the West Bank, because as we know, the underlying logic of the Israeli government, and we've heard this even from the opposition, even from Yair Lapid, the policy in the West Bank is maximum land, minimum Palestinians. On the other hand, Gaza, which until this point at least wasn't seen as a kind of desirable territory for annexation, was seen as a kind of conveyor belt to bring Palestinians into Gaza instead. This is an act of forced displacement, and it's arguably also a war crime of forcible transfer. So it's really important that the international community push back on the separation policy and talk again, bring back to the table the viability of a Palestinian state by having access between different parts of the Palestinian territory, because otherwise it's unclear to me how a two-state solution could even begin to actually become a reality if Gaza is still being isolated and cut off from the rest of the Palestinian economy, social life, family life, everything else.
Just following up on UNRWA. So we've got allegations that at least 12 employees of UNRWA were somehow involved in October 7. And then there was some further allegations about perhaps a total of 30. We know there's been criticism in the diaspora and by Israel for years, partly related to the return of refugees issue. What's your take on UNRWA? 13,000 employees there. Is this a question of bad apples? Is this a bad basket? Is this a more generalized problem? What's your take?
Thanks. I think that my response to that would be twofold. Firstly, that I think it's very important that we reward transparency and accountability. I think that those individuals were immediately fired, which I know that there was criticism from the other side that they were not given any kind of due process. They were immediately fired. And the aim of doing so was, of course, to make sure that every UNRWA employee is meeting the code of conduct and not performing any kind of illegal activity, and also to demonstrate to the world that UNRWA takes very seriously these allegations. And unfortunately, even with that, with the level of seriousness that they took during a massive humanitarian effort, they still, rightly took that very seriously. And unfortunately, the reward for that was still a defunding from many of UNRWA's important funders. So I think it's really important to say that, and to say about, UNRWA, as I mentioned, being the backbone of the humanitarian response. And yeah, I think I'll leave it there, actually.
Maytal, I think we're going to move to questions from the audience and questions from our online participants. Okay. Okay. I see Karen Golden, and then I see Jenny. So Karen, start us off.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, thank you so much for this. This whole day is just incredible. I two questions. One is, as a legal organization, there's a lot that's been talked about with respect to Israel's right to self-defense. And I wonder if you've had the argument or dealt with the argument that actually Israel, because it is either an occupier by virtue of the blockade and the level of control, or an occupier because it still occupies the West Bank, and the West Bank and Gaza are meant to be a contiguous Palestinian state. So it still has the role of occupier, that the right of self-defense doesn't actually attach to the occupier. It's like analogous to, breaking into someone's home, to steal something, and they and you claim self-defense, by when you were the one in there in the first place. Um, my other question is about, and I know we're focused on the Israeli side of the conduct, and holding Israel to account, but I just sometimes feel that to kind of deal with that appropriately or understand the full context, when you were talking about the food restriction and the calorie counts and all of these things from the blockade, like the role of kind of Hamas on the other side, and the funding that's coming in from Qatar, and the concept of, or what was happening, that wasn't going to build Gaza in any way, or the capacity to help the population feed itself, but for tunnels to launch attacks against Israel, and how that impacts Israel's obligations. So sorry, it's a long question.
Thank you. Regarding your first question, it's not something that I'd fully prepared, and I really welcome also the perspective that you've brought. I think it's interesting to talk about. I think that when I talk about the Israel's right to self-defense, I mean primarily its right to defend its citizens, who have a right not to live in fear of being just like indiscriminately targeted, as is a human right that they enjoy just as much as anyone else. And obviously, I live in Israel, and I want to enjoy that right as well, not to live in fear. I think that that's what I mean specifically when I talk about that. And I think that we can talk about what it means territorially as well. And obviously, we heard in the previous meeting in the panel about the amount of resources that Israel puts into defending its citizens in the occupied territories, i.e. settlers. So obviously, we can talk about, what does that right to self-defense, how does it extend when people are carrying out these illegal acts? But I think all of us can agree that it's not the case that we want extrajudicial killings or people to be indiscriminately targeted, even, despite whether they're an occupier or even a settler or not. That's not the means by which we think, the issue should be addressed. Regarding your second question about the role of Hamas in decisions which have contributed to Palestinian de-development, specifically in Gaza. The blockade is a massive factor in the de-development of Gaza and its economy. At the end of 2022, unemployment in Gaza was at 46.6%. Among youth, that was 60%. And as I'm sure everyone knows, Gaza is an incredibly young population, with about half of the population being under 19. I think 70% are under 30. So it's a very young population, also a very educated population, which is suffering from massive unemployment and underemployment. It's true that there's obviously decisions made by the de facto government, Hamas, which also contributed to this de-development. But again, as is always my kind of my move, why don't we also turn that lens onto ourselves? Israel spends such a big proportion of its budget, rightly or wrongly, on the military. And, we're talking about these government decisions under the context of obviously active hostilities. So I think it's important that we ask ourselves, just like we talked about and we didn't talk specifically about UNRWA schools, but we talked in the previous panel about what are we teaching our kids in schools? And is so easy for us to point to the other side and say they're teaching their kids to hate and we're teaching our kids to love. But really, we're teaching government mandated curricula, which say that we can't have the green line brought out in a map. So I'd say the same thing for the decisions of our government and where they choose to invest in us as civilians. How much of that is going to, municipality, our lives, and how much of it is going to military? And I think it's also true on the other side. So while I do think that Hamas is an actor which has much responsibility for the suffering of Palestinians in Gaza, it's also the case that Israel is an actor that also has a lot of responsibility for the de-development of Gaza.
Jenny.
Just a basic question around some of the international aid organizations that you can sort of like unabashedly say, these are great to support and we can share this with our network and our friends and our family without any kind of hesitation.
Other than UNRWA, you mean?
Yes.
What other organizations should
Sure.
people be giving to, I think is the question.
Interesting question. I think that there's a vast array of international organizations which are very active in the humanitarian response. They're ones that I work with all the time. So World Central Kitchen is obviously one of them. Obviously, they've currently paused their operations in Gaza, but there's a hope that with increased deconfliction, with the things that Israel's promised, which we hope will begin to see, maybe they'd be able to resume their work. The World Food Programme is also doing a lot. Action Against Hunger is also doing a lot. I can also speak to you afterwards, but there's very many international agencies which are doing everything that they can to get food into the mouths of starving people in Gaza and to get medical care. You can obviously also contribute to, if it's more comfortable for you, you can contribute to human rights organizations, not just humanitarians. There you have many other, you have Oxfam, Amnesty, all of the other human rights organizations, obviously the Israeli human rights organizations as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to direct your resources where you feel they can make change.
And some of the failures, I guess, in truthful and hard truths, or in the Israeli education system. How much consciousness is there of that within Israel? And are there groups kind of working against that or pushing back?
I'll just say that I was listening to a New Israel Fund employee who has 2 kids going to school in Haifa, and their kids' class did not know what the occupation was. They had not heard of the occupation. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of the 2 worlds that people are living in. And then we're going to turn it over to
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add more from that, just because it's not really Gisha's mandate. I'm happy to speak from my personal capacity as well, that I, as a child, my aunt was living in the occupied territories with my cousins, and I went many times to their settlement, and I didn't know what the occupation was when I was a child, and I didn't see Palestinians. And there's a huge amount of energy that goes into blocking the reality and to shaping perceptions. But as I said, it's not fully our mandate, so I think I'll leave it there.
I'll just say that I've got 2 nephews who are now in their 50s, and they have been listening to Bibi Netanyahu say there is no partner for peace. And when I talk to them about peace being the way out of this, they still tell me there's no partner for peace. So, I mean, I think we've heard today that if you want a partner for peace, you've got to hold out your hand, and then maybe you'll have a partner. So we'll see whether this is a changing event or not.
I'm asking a question from behind you. I don't know how you're going to, I'll trust that you're listening. So there's one question that I want to get to that you've both kind of answered in terms of Israeli civil society, but so I'm going to ask 2 questions together because I think one is a little bit shorter. The first is, are ordinary Israelis aware of the situation in Gaza before October 7th and now? Is it reported at all in Israeli newspapers or Israeli media? And then there's another question that says, well, I totally get what Rebecca is talking about in terms of lack of freedom of movement, the restriction of fuel, and how that affects everything from getting water into home and lots more. What is the answer to ensure for how to ensure that terrorists don't enter Israel, and how to prevent fuel being used for bombs? Is there a danger in allowing full freedom of movement and free movement of fuel?
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone in the chat as well. I have not forgotten about you being there. Okay, so the first question about are Israelis aware? As I mentioned before, the Israeli news cycle is incredibly attuned to our suffering as Israelis. And there's a degree to which that's of course understandable that we would be talking about the suffering in our own communities. But the humanitarian catastrophe is not covered on the Israeli news. When we hear news from Gaza, it's about our soldiers and what's happened to them. We don't hear about the suffering of civilians in Gaza, and we certainly don't hear any responsibility being taken for that suffering. There's a lot of delegitimization of the international community and the world at large. I think that there's a lot of Israelis who wrongly perceive any kind of accountability that is put on Israel for the current situation as anti-Semitism. I think that, of course, there is anti-Semitism in the world, but there's also a lot of obfuscation being done, which is an attempt to shift responsibility and deny our responsibility about the suffering in Gaza. So I think that there is a lack of awareness of what's going on in Gaza for Palestinians. Regarding the question about freedom of movement, it's not the case that Gisha advocates for total freedom of movement without any kind of security measures. Again, it's about proportionality, reasonableness. So individual security screenings, for example, as is done currently on the very small minority who are eligible to leave Gaza, are vetted. And what we want is a massive expansion of the criteria of eligibility and the ability for the everyday person to exercise their freedom of movement. That doesn't mean no individual screenings. There's also ways in which the Israel or the international community can ensure that fuel goes to the places that it's needed. There can be accompaniments. There can be other creative means to make sure that fuel is being used correctly. And these kind of forms of collective punishment, as I talked about, these blanket bans as a result of risk. First of all, as I mentioned, they're questionable about their kind of security efficacy, and they're also they're illegal under international law, and they are morally questionable as well. To carry out blanket bans as a form of collective punishment because of, rightly or wrongly perceived security risks, and to use security as a justification for punishing large swathes of a 2.2 million person population, that's what's not justifiable. And I'll give one example, which is in recent years, there was a shipment of fish which was coming out of Gaza, which had some contraband materials in it. So something that could be used probably for military means. I don't know exactly what the item was, but something which Israel, due to security reasons, wanted to confiscate. And for 3 weeks after that, no fish was allowed by Israeli policy to be sold out of Gaza, causing massive economic downturn in Gaza because fishing is one of the central industries of Gaza. So this is the kind of collective punishment that I'm talking about, these blanket bans, which really affect all parts of civilian life and economy in the name of security.
Okay, no more questions. Okay, we've got one here and one there. Two people, but one question. Sitting beside.
Thank you. So you provided like a lot of very great information, and thank you for that. And we talked a lot about how Israelis are not like are blindly unaware of what's happening in Gaza. They may have some kind of an excuse in a way, but we don't. Like, I mean, we're in Canada, we're safe. But I hear a lot of pushback from my own community, like from the Jewish community. Every time I try to kind of raise a different voice, being like, hey, let's look at this. So so at this point, I'm literally trolling everyone with articles from like Breaking the Silence, from Gisha, from like a lot of other organization. And what I hear is that, oh, but they're anti-Israel, but I mean, you're Israelis. Do you have any, like, I don't know if it's tips or whatever, that would help bring your voice further? Because I feel like a lot of people who are here, like me, we know you in a way, like we know you, we know your organizations and we support your work. But that's unfortunately not the case of the majority, I feel, of the Jewish community at this point. So how do we raise awareness?
That's such an important point, because I think so many of us are feeling alienated from parts of the Jewish community.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like I hold quite a unique perspective, or maybe not, the opposite of unique, like general, because I'm a member of both the diaspora community and the Israeli community, obviously being from London. And so for me, I first of all just want to say thank you. And I want to say that I really stand in solidarity with how you're feeling. I think this is a very lonely and polarizing time to be in the Jewish diaspora or to be on the left in Israel. It's a very dark time, and it can feel like we're just shouting into the void sometimes. And I really do understand how you feel. I think that there's many things. I think first of all, as you talked about, we use us. We're Israeli CSOs. We have an interest in Israel, you know, in Israelis being able to live in peace and security. We have the ultimate interest, our own lives, the lives of our partners, our children, everyone else. You know, so many people that we love. And I think that as much as you can kind of platform that, I understand that you're saying it's not always effective, and unfortunately some people just don't want to hear another perspective, but as much as you can, to emphasize that this is not some kind of foreign agency, enemy, state, whatever perspective, anti-Semitic perspective on what's going on. This is the perspective of people who are really living that reality. I think that, you know, making that point can sometimes be effective. I think also this is a moment which is incredibly lonely also for people who consider themselves on the global left. I think that it's a very painful time for many people. But having said that, I think that finding partnership and solidarity with others who do see where we're coming from, who value our lives, as well as, you know, the lives of every human in the region, I think can be a great resource. And ultimately, I think this isn't really a tip. But I think coming to events like this, as you already have, can be incredibly heartening and important. Having those open conversations in our community, I'll speak candidly that I spoke within my own community last week. I spoke in London, and I really felt like I can do this all over the world except for at home. I was really terrified to speak at home because it's not an easy time in the Jewish community. We're very divided. But I was met with such a warm atmosphere, so much curiosity. And I think it's important to remember that the people with the most extreme and stubborn views are the ones that shout the loudest, but it doesn't mean they represent the majority. I think people really feel that in this darkness, everyone's looking for a guide and looking for some light, and that can come from each other. And I don't think that you need to bow to the voice of the mighty and the strong, because they're probably just doing it because they want to block out everyone else. But actually, I think most of our community really do want to understand how things can be better. And I think that's a great starting point for all of these conversations.
Thanks very much for that. Okay. Okay. It's a brilliant way to end. Thank you so much. So let me just end by thanking you, Rebecca, so much for your presentation and for that last hopeful message. Maytal, thanks to you. Thanks to all of you for coming, and thanks to all of you online for participating. You're supposed to go have a cup of coffee and something to eat, and we will meet all again at, well, the break meet is now, and it's 15 minutes again.
We're being realistic about how y'all are. We'll be back at 4:30 in the main room.
Thanks so much.